and learning some things I did not know about Reverend Jackson. So I think let's just jump into it and talk about why you decided to do this book. I'm interested in knowing the genesis of the idea, the point at which you said there's a book here and I should actually write it.
Yeah, it began for me, this was in 2020. And I was actually kind of in the middle of covering the 2020 presidential election. And this was after I had covered 2016 and 2020. And in that race, actually, Jesse Jackson had kind of reemerged suddenly in the Democratic primary to endorse, of all people, Bernie Sanders. And a lot of folks were like, that seems odd. Why would he endorse Bernie Sanders? And that, I think that thought kind of stuck with me for a while. And over the course of that summer, as you know, this was the summer of George Floyd and all of that. And I think it really kind of brought into focus the need, frankly, for there to be a memorialization of Black history, especially some of these figures who are of a certain generation that we know is passing. And it kept coming back to me that this idea of Jesse Jackson as a political figure, and Jesse Jackson as a forerunner, and even perhaps a forefather of a particular type of populist politics, that seemed to be something that had not been particularly well explored. I mean, people remember Run, Jesse, Run, right, of the 80s, and the speeches and the signs, but I think it has taken 20 years between 1988 and 2008, maybe another 30 years for the sort of Bernie Sanders era and so on, for the real impact of his legacy to become clear. And so this book is about that, and it's written not just for people like me who, I'm a millennial. I was born a couple weeks after the 1988 campaign was over. So there are plenty of people my age and younger for whom this is really a new story. But also for people who lived through it and maybe thought, well, that was just a moment in history. I think that what this book argues is that it was just the beginning of something that took many decades to really mature in our politics, and we're still living through that moment now.
The interesting thing is that I remember I was a freshman at Howard in 1987, and I remember the Congressional Black Caucus Legislative Weekend, which all of the kind of Black political establishment was present at, and everyone was kind of suspecting that Jesse Jackson was going to run again because he had run in 1984, and he shows up at this event. People, he's not a scheduled speaker there, but he's in the room when people ask him to say something. And he goes through this impassioned, kind of galvanizing speech about what America needs. And he starts with first off, with Reverend Jackson, you ask a question, but the answer you get may not necessarily be
100%.
Exactly. He's going to answer. He's going to say the thing that he wants to say. And so he got a question about HBCUs, and it turned into a "Why you need me to run for president" response. But it was the most galvanizing, amazing thing that I'd ever seen. And one of the things I think that your book conveys is, one, the unlikely nature of it, and then just how much he contributed and how much the modern Democratic Party kind of bears his likeness in some ways. And so I wondered, that long preface, I wondered if you might talk about just why that is, like what it is that Jesse Jackson achieved in those two outside presidential campaigns.
Well, I think that's a perfect description of the impact, because his imprint on the campaign is in some obvious ways and in some less obvious ways. I think some of the obvious ways are the logistics of how the Democratic Party works. So the Democratic Party now has a primary process that is not winner take all. It allows for people to gain delegates as they go along in the primary process. Now that sounds a little arcane until you think about the fact that there are candidates, whether you're talking about Barack Obama or a Bernie Sanders, whose candidacies would have basically been dead in the water had Jesse Jackson not changed the rules to allow them to have a shot at the nomination, even if they were not the heavyweights in the race, the obvious favorites. And that is, I think, for the Democratic Party, that is a symbol of a democratization of their primary process, their nominating process, that allows outsiders into the process. But I think there are many other things. You know, Jesse Jackson in the 80s was talking about universal health care. You know, he was talking about the working class in ways that, frankly, the Democratic Party kind of forgot for a couple of decades there, and have only now started to re-examine how they talk to working class voters, white working class voters, black working class voters, people of color, whatever. So he was in that time crafting this message around how you talk to working people and bring them into a tent. He also ran on forcing the Democratic Party to have a real tent that really took people seriously, that took women seriously, that took Black and Hispanic and Asian and Arab American voters seriously. The big tent Democratic Party that we know today was emboldened, in part created by Jesse Jackson and the voter registration drives that he did, the coalition building that he did. And then there's the personnel. If you operate in politics, there are so many alums of Jesse Jackson's campaigns who are running the party, who are operating at the highest levels of party politics today, and they would not be a part of the process if he had not fought for that, if he had not run. People like Mignon Moore and Donna Brazile, these are some of the more prominent names that you would know, but these are people who came into politics. Maxine Waters, she was a state legislature in California, but she was also the chair of Jesse Jackson's campaign in 1988 in California. So there are so many figures whose prominence in Democratic politics comes from Jesse Jackson and his political campaigns, and that is also the lasting legacy. That's not even including the cabinet secretaries and the Clinton administration and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So, Ron Walters, who was one of Jesse's campaign strategists in '88, had been one of my political science professors at Howard years later, and well, actually not, actually around that time, but
yeah, not that much later.
Yeah, not that much later. But when Barack Obama was on the verge of clinching the nomination, I called Professor Walters because it was for people who knew what Jesse Jackson had done in 1988. When they had 7 million votes, and you walk in and the party is like, "What do you want?" And one of the things they wanted was this proportional system. And I said, "Did you all intend to create a pathway for a Black presidential candidate?" And he said, "No. We didn't know that was going to be the thing that came out of it. But we were trying to open up the process to make the Democratic Party more responsive to people on the grassroots."
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
I don't know that I definitely don't think that Jesse Jackson knew that the beneficiary of this would ultimately end up being a Black candidate. But yeah, the rationale was, this is a system that is set up to lock out outsiders. Mm-hmm. And outsiders can be anybody. It can be anybody who's maybe challenging the status quo, who's not the front runner, who's a person of color. And I think that he was right about that. A winner-take-all system is in fact designed to award a huge advantage to somebody who is in the lead and to completely eliminate people who are not. And so there were so many aspects of this that I don't think Jesse Jackson quite knew what would come of it. But he did have this instinct about it where he understood that the democratization of the process was just as important as the outcome.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the proportional system for the nominating process. He was a big opponent of the runoff primary system that was predominantly in southern states. And he argued even at that time that was designed to keep black candidates out, which I think many people still believe to be true, because there's still a few states that have it, including Georgia. And so he was very focused on the tactics of democracy and how the structure of these institutions can result in inequities. And ultimately, I think what came out of these campaigns was the execution of the strategic breaking down of some of those barriers that ultimately helped Obama tremendously. And not just Obama, but a lot of other black candidates at the sort of lower levels helped them gain political power in a lot of different ways.
So Jesse Jackson represents a lot of different things, especially over the kind of course of his life. He of course comes out of the civil rights movement, and then in the aftermath of Dr. King's death, evolves into these different iterations, one of which decides in 1983 to launch this campaign. Can you talk a little bit about the arc? Because he's a bridge in a lot of ways between the movement and the kind of political development. Can you talk about Jesse's personal arc between being Dr. King's lieutenant and then the niche that he comes to occupy in American life in later decades?
Yeah, I mean, the story for him really starts where he grew, where he was born, in Greenville, South Carolina. And the fact of his birth, he was born to a teenage mother who had him out of wedlock. And he later discovers, when he's around eight years old or so, that the man who had been living next door was his biological father. And he lived a lot of his young life as a man with something to prove, and was always, I think, striving for that. But he also was incredibly gifted in many ways. He was just sort of, I think he had just won the genetic lottery in some ways. He was tall, he was a football player, he was a quarterback, good looking, yeah. He had a pretty easy time, sort of being a popular kid in high school. And he goes to college. First he went to University of Illinois, and then he transferred to A&T. And when he gets to A&T, he starts being mentored by some of the sort of giants of the civil rights, the intellectual basis of the civil rights movement. I think Dr. Samuel Proctor, I think, was the dean of the school at A&T at the time, and kind of took him under his wing, and basically said to him,
this is North Carolina A&T.
Yeah, North Carolina A&T. You should learn from Dr. King. He goes up to the March on Washington. He's watching from the audience. So he decides to go to seminary school, and in the middle of seminary school, Selma happens, and Bloody Sunday happens. And he's watching it with his classmates, and they decide to get on a bus and go down to Selma. And they're driving for days, they get to Selma, and he shows up at the church, and he encounters Ambassador Andrew Young. He wasn't the ambassador then, but he's now known as Ambassador Andy Young, and the close deputy of Dr. King's. And he says to Andy Young, "Why don't you guys go to sleep? I'll watch these guys. I'll make sure that nobody gets into trouble." And Andy Young was like, "I don't know who this guy is, but sure, And at that moment, I think there was a realization that he had this sort of leadership ability, but he also was incredibly bold,